Hola chicos, bienvenidos al circo. Bienvenidos al circo. Eh, a ver, he grabado el vídeo de Pokémon, ya por fin. He grabado el vídeo de Pokémon. Eh, no avisa esto, ¿no? Porque hemos hecho un stream hace muy poco, ¿no? Hemos grabado el vídeo de Pokémon, con lo cual, pues, no, lo que no sé si subirlo. Chicos, vosotros lo subiríais ya honestamente. ¿Lo subiríais al secundario o al principal? Vosotros que sois gente lista. ¿Lo subiríais al secundario y que tenga las views que tenga y da igual, que es lo que yo había pensado? ¿O subiríais al principal porque creéis que al final lo he enfocado por tal, ¿sabes? Yo creo que yo les he dicho que al secundario, ¿sabes? El vídeo está bien, el vídeo está chulo. De hecho, el abrir cartas es solo al final del stream, ¿sabes? O sea, es al final del vídeo, ¿sabes? Al principio se explican varias cosas y tal, ¿no? Pero yo he dicho al secundario, ¿sabes? Porque me dan un poco más igual las views. Creo que hoy puedo hacer perfectamente un vídeo sobre la decisión de tipos al final del día de hoy y subir más al este, ¿sabes? El vídeo queda bastante bien, ¿sabes? O sea, ha molado. Ha molado porque explico muchas cosas y tal, y un poco que la matriz de pago se parece mucho a la lotería, a cosas, a juegos como la lotería, ¿sabes? ¿Está Kevin ya por aquí o no? ¿Qué tal el podcast este? ¿No aparezco yo por aquí? A ver qué tal se me ve. ¿Qué tal se me ve, chat?
Si estás trabajando y no estás creando patrimonio de ninguna forma, estás en lo que se llama la carrera de la rata, y es que estás pillado por las facturas. Es decir, no eres capaz de salir de ahí y en el momento que te falte el trabajo o las pensiones no cumplan con lo esperado o lo que sea, pues te vas a ver en una encrucijada.
Hoy en día, en 2026, ¿sigue siendo buena idea seguir teniendo esa liquidez en fondos monetarios?
Técnicamente te sigues empobreciendo. Ese 2 y pico % que te pagan, que encima al día que lo vendas te quitarán los impuestos de esas ganancias, se te va a quedar en un 1 y pico real, cuando la inflación, nos quieren decir que está al 2 y pico, pero probablemente sea mentira. Técnicamente estás ganando dinero, pero no el suficiente como para mantener tu poder adquisitivo.
¿Merece la pena hoy en día invertir en acciones frente a los fondos de inversión?
Por lo general no. Rara vez una persona, por muy experta que se crea, lo va a hacer mejor que los gestores profesionales.
De cara a este 2026, ¿crees que hay algún activo que nos pueda sorprender para bien o para mal?
Creo que ya lo está haciendo, y creo que los grandes descuidados de este año son la de una.
Voy a dejarle aquí un like, chat. Esto luego os lo veis, chicos. Poner esto. Hay que ayudar a la gente, hombre. Podcast rompiendo el mercado con el jefe. Con el jefe. Vamos a poner esto por aquí. ¿Vale?
Cartera ideal de renta variable, si no quieres complicarte, MSC igual más emergentes, por ejemplo 80-20, y te olvidas, ¿no? Y a mí me preguntas qué es lo ideal a día de hoy, yo más o menos voy 50-50. 50% y 50%.
¿Tu Bitcoin lo ves como una oportunidad?
En Bitcoin yo lo llamo más bien especular. Tú estás comprando algo para que venga otro, y sin que cambie nada en ese lingote o en ese Bitcoin, venga otro y esté dispuesto a pagar más por eso cuando es exactamente lo mismo, cosa que en una empresa no es verdad, ¿no?
Si tuvieras que mañana poner el 80% de tu patrimonio en un solo activo que no pudieras tocar en los próximos 5 o 10 años...
Y desde luego me dijeras 2 o 3, yo sé que esto a lo mejor es una unpopular opinion, sería la...
¿Qué tal? Bienvenidos a...
Sería la renta fija, chat. Sería la renta fija. Qué bien habla este tío siempre, macho. O sea, no es por tirarme flores, ¿eh? O sea, a lo mejor soy yo que me veo la velocidad y digo, ¿sabes? Como que no se va por las ramas, ¿sabes? Que hay contenido que no lo quieres pasar, no le quieres dar más velocidad, no nada, ¿no? O sea, la sensación de, joder, me están contando cosas, ¿sabes? La verdad es que Sí, la renta fija, lo digo en el podcast, ¿eh? Digo estos antes de la guerra, ¿sabes? Em, pero, o sea, quiero decir, no sé, como que me
Era el
escucho.
gestor, de esto hará 12 años o una cosa así. Y ahí me di cuenta como, oye, que hay profesionales que lo van a hacer mucho mejor que tú. Además fue la época dorada, ¿no? Del value español, donde pues un 20 anualizado era casi algo común, ¿no? O un 15 anualizado. Y entonces ahí ya me empecé a dar cuenta, oye, que se puede hacer dinero dejando que los profesionales gestionen, ¿no? Y todavía no era la fiebre de los indexados ni de los ETFs, con lo cual, cuando yo empecé, pues no era lo que había ahora, ¿no? Ahora, si volviera a empezar, creo que haría las cosas diferentes. Luego, más adelante, sí que ya después de tener un buen track record en fondos de renta variable, también en algunas operaciones que hice yo por mi cuenta, pues sí que decidí apalancarme en inmuebles, que es otro tipo de inversión, que es pues, pedir prestado para comprar un inmueble, alquilarlo y demás, que luego con el boom que tendrían los inmuebles, especialmente en Madrid, pues me saldría increíblemente bien. Entonces, creo que la mezcla de invertir en fondos y luego utilizar algo de apalancamiento en inmuebles y todo eso, creo que todavía sigue siendo una forma óptima o bastante útil de crear patrimonio, pero bueno, lo de los inmuebles es opinable, o sea, podrías hacerlo todo en fondos, no tienes por qué buscar el.
Nada, nada, o sea, a lo mejor es porque soy yo, pero
Take it.
me gusta, tío. O
Purple
sea, no sé, o
pod.
sea, yo me lo
Are we
vería.
going laptop today?
Yo me lo vería,
No?
chicos.
Windows laptop? Windows
Hay que hablar con
laptop.
el banco que la hipoteca al tío ese y mi
Okay.
padre por empresa le hará el préstamo al 6 aprox, acordando comprar la hipoteca al banco.
And we'll do a little market
Bueno,
recovers. If above, if all
esto ya ha salido, ¿no?
above, market rallies. Market
Tío, qué pena no haber estado
rallies
online antes, ¿no? Esto tiene que salir ya. Vale,
towards
sí, se mantienen tipos, ¿vale,
607.
chicos?
All
Aquí
right.
lo veis.
All right. Here we go. Who's ready? Who's
Who's
ready, boys
ready?
and girls? Here we go. And okay, we have
A ver,
2.4% GDP growth forecast. Officials, Fed funds rates
¿eso
at
es
the end of
bueno?
27, 3.1, 3.4. Let's go. 3.4 at the end of the year. They're still pricing in a cut. That's
Eso es bueno.
fantastic.
Eso es bueno.
The vote in favor of policy was 11-1, with Myron dissenting in favor of a 25 basis point cut. Attentive to risks on both sides of the dual mandate. Job gains have remained low and have been little changed in recent
Eso
months.
es bueno.
Inflation has remained somewhat elevated. Job gains have remained low. Unemployment rate little changed. Available indicators suggest economic activity has been expanding at a solid pace. Federal Reserve leaves rates unchanged. That summary of economic projections at 3.4.
Está bien.
Whew, that's good. Median Fed funds rate also 3.4. We're going to look at the statement in just a moment here once it
Le da igual.
populates, but I'm just reading it off here. Fed funds rate, longer run, 3.1. That's up a little bit from 3.0. That's fine. Still implying that 25 basis points of cuts for your, what's it called, for this year.
Esto no ha sido el cierre, ¿verdad, chicos? ¿Cómo ha cerrado esto? Esto no ha sido el cierre, ¿no? ¿Cómo ha cerrado esto, chat? Ah, este ha sido el cierre, ¿no? Bueno, no es el mejor día, pero no es un mal día.
So FOMC March coming in, still implying a rate cut this year, which markets are still pricing into about 70%. I'm actually surprised that hasn't changed. Let's go take a look at the projection material. It is out now. Okay, here we go. This is fantastic news. This is really good.
Es bueno,
this is rallyable, in my opinion. So I've got 3.4. This is great news. You did not want this to be over 3.6. That's fantastic. Look at this, folks. None of them changed. 3.6, 3.6, 3.6, 3.5. Good. That's great. Change in the unemployment rate, 4.4. Great. This is fantastic. So let's go to the bingo board. The good column over here is very, very happy.
¿Os
So
enteráis,
we got
chicos?
that, we got that, we got that.
¿Os
Okay,
enteráis?
the rest we'll still have to work on, obviously. Okay, continuing here. Change in real GDP. Actually, they wrote up GDP over here. Wow. GDP written up in each year. 26 up 0.1, 27 up 0.3, and 2028 up 0.2. So a big GDP write-up here, well, I mean, a big suggestion of positivity by a GDP write-up in each of these years. That is not a recession by any means here.
Bien,
the lowest
chicos.
we get here in 2028 is 1.8 on a range, but the central tendency here is that we're going to be above 1.8 to 2% here. This is actually very bullish
Ahora lo
projection
explico,
material.
Ahora lo explico. Ahora lo
Very
explico.
good. I've got the unemployment rate staying stable per estimates. Yeah, here we go. PCE inflation. They do write these up, but I think the market will care less about these. So obviously we've seen those projections move up. And then it does look like, okay, I just got a report that the Saudi Defense Ministry says it intercepted and destroyed a drone attempt that was attempting to reach a natural gas facility. No injuries reported. So we can see we're pretty consolidated over here for 2026. This is going to be
¿Cómo de Ponzi es que iba a poner esta funda sin esta carta sin firma, chat? Con un gracias por venir el perro este sin firma.
the no cut group right here. No cut. Then we're going to have the one cut and then more cuts, sort of dots, if you will. You can see it looks like most people averaging to about, yeah, actually, I think I might have to move this down a little bit. 3.6, that's roughly where we are now. No, that's about accurate.
Creo que no se pueden poner subtítulos aquí, chicos. Es en directo. No se puede.
One cut.
Ahora lo
What
explico,
Jerome Powell says, too soon to make any determination.
Tío, esto no ha tirado, No entiendo por qué, chicos. No entiendo por qué no ha tirado. No entiendo por qué no ha tirado el mercado. Si lo que están diciendo... A ver, os explico, chicos, ¿vale? ¿Estamos todos o falta alguien, chicos? ¿Habéis pasado la lista de la clase? ¿Sabéis si estamos todos? No. ¿O me va a tocar explicarlo 100 veces? Pregunto. ¿Estamos todos? Vale. ¿Falta algún pipero por ahí o no? Presente. ¿Falta Fufupau? Básicamente, lo que se hace en esto, cuando se salen, bueno, a ver cómo, a ver cómo explico esto, tío. Vale, son muchas cosas, ¿vale? A y media es el informe, o mejor, la rueda de prensa, mejor dicho, el informe es ahora, ¿vale? Entonces, a y media es la rueda de prensa, ¿vale? En punto es cuando dicen cómo han dejado los tipos de interés y qué esperan de la economía estadounidense, ¿vale? ¿Qué esperan de todas las áreas de la economía estadounidense, ¿no? Lo más grave, o lo que yo era más, ¿ves? ¿Por qué no sabemos nada, chicos? Yo dije que esto sería tóxico y no ha sido así. Lo más grave estaba ligado a las bajadas de tipos, que asumieran que iba a haber menos bajadas de tipos de lo esperado, ¿vale? Aún así, no lo han revisado al alza y siguen pensando que va a haber bajadas de tipos este año, ¿vale? Esto luego lo haré en un vídeo, ¿no? Lo mismo con el PIB. Se podría esperar a lo mejor una proyección de PIB inferior, pero no ha sido así, ¿vale? Y el empleo tampoco lo han revisado bueno, en este caso el empleo a la baja o el desempleo al alza. Con lo cual, todo lo que es la proyección no ha empeorado a pesar de la guerra, ¿vale? No ha empeorado. Entonces, todo eso es muy positivo, porque yo me esperaba pues algún tipo pues eso, de dato negativo, ¿no? Incluso el PIB lo han mejorado, chicos, el PIB lo han mejorado.
I do think he'll say we're in a good place. You know, we're in a good place. So let's throw that onto the bingo board. So we'll go with back to the red pen.
Pero fíjate que yo era un poco pesimista, ¿sabes? Yo era un poco pesimista.
We're in a good place. Okay, good. More work to do on inflation, labor market weakening, but downplays with
Eso quiere decir que nadie da un duro porque la guerra se mantenga mucho, ¿sabes?
Obviously, we think, we'll hear the word dual mandate. I do not think he will say the word transitory. Does not use word transitory. Okay. So let's keep looking at this statement over here. Powell will be up in about 25 minutes to talk, but overall, this is very much as expected, very benign.
A ver,
No
dejarme escuchar esto.
implication of hikes, stable for now. Nothing burger so far. You know, obviously, it's going to depend on what Powie Wowie says, but so far, this is pretty decent. Let's go take a look at the market's reaction. Market's not really moving off of this yet. Still waiting for JPOW. It somewhat suggests a lot of this is mostly priced in. Seems like this table is mostly as expected. Priced in. Okay. Let's see what other projection material we can get out of here. So... uncertainty about PCE inflation has obviously risen. No surprise here. Weighted risks to the upside on inflation. So we could say that here.
No, sí que dicen un poco de posible, pues eso,
risks
de riesgos de inflación al alza, ¿no?
And over here we could put downside.
Pero aún así no afecta en lo que a tipos de interés se refiere. ¿Sabes?
All right. Okay. Continuing here, we have PCE. That's PCE. Changing real GDP. I mean, they're really quite optimistic here. There's no, recession indication over here. We might even say that no. Recession is not base case. Recession is not base case. Okay, good. Then
no entiendo por qué
PC
no.
inflation core, that's fine. What do we have here? Confidence, Fed funds, that's fine.
¿Nos creemos lo que dice la Fed o están haciendo política para que no haya pánico? Precisamente Powell y Trump no son muy amigos, ¿eh? ¿Sabes? O sea, yo me esperaba, pues, tío, alguna revisión a la baja de algo, ¿sabes? O unos tipos de interés promedio más elevados durante este año. Se siguen esperando bajas de tipos, ¿sabes? El tipo medio esperado para Estados Unidos para este año es 3,4. Eso significan entre una y dos bajadas, ¿no? Este año. Cosa que me sorprende, ¿no? Pero a priori, coño, que en el primer no haya revisiones a la baja de nada, pues menos mal que no hay revisiones a la baja de nada. Y el mercado aún así no ha hecho nada, ¿sabes? De todas formas, a ver qué dice Powell, ¿no? Pero de primeras, este informe no es malo, ¿sabes? Luego hago un vídeo de esto, ¿sabes? ¿Cómo que gol del Barça? ¿Está jugando el Barça ahora? ¿Está jugando el Barça? ¿2-1 van? Porque llevan jugando ya Rafinha y Marc Bernal. A mí todo esto, los tipos de interés y riesgo financiero en general no me gusta mucho. Te estás equivocando, creo que deberías dedicar más tiempo a abrir cartas Pokémon. Ya he hecho el vídeo de Pokémon, tío. He hecho el vídeo de Pokémon. Os hago un spoiler, chat. Un spoiler de 30 segundos, chat. Lo siento a los que no les gusten las cartas. Soy un fuertes, tío. Lo enseño para que nadie me acuse de que, bueno, que se ve que abro la caja, ¿no? O sea, que quiero decir que si abro la caja en directo no puedo meter el pato, pero que tengo el pato dos veces, ¿sabes? Que soy un suertudo. Que he cogido la caja que tenía música, ¿sabes? He cogido la caja con música. Chat, os he spoileado un poco el vídeo a los que estabais en este directo, ¿sabes? Pero lo digo, enseño los dos para que veáis que tengo dos, que es que no es el antiguo, ¿sabes? Que el que abro es otra vez el pato este, ¿sabes? Lo he vuelto a abrir. Para estas bajadas entiendo que se basan en datos hasta febrero que no había guerra. No sé hasta cuándo son los datos, ¿sabes? No lo sé. No, bueno, sale V más un poquito, ¿sabes? Sale 8%. Bueno, no os quiero tal, tío. Ya lo miraréis. ¿Sabes? Me sale el pato mareado. ¿Cómo que gol? ¿Gol de quién? ¡Hay gal! ¡Hay gal! ¡Hay gal! El pato, chat. Os ha arruinado. De todas formas, ese vídeo lo sacaré en el canal secundario.
Fine. Fleet. Changed to little changed. Okay. Why it does this, I don't know.
¿Gol del
Fix that.
Newcastle? ¿Todavía la va a liar el Barça?
Oh,
¿Crees que realmente está aplicando una regla para priorizar anclar la inflación por debajo del 3?
All right, there we go.
Estamos viendo el futuro de
Okay.
un hike preventivo.
Let's
El
see
shock de oferta.
here. Dual
¿Qué
side of the
dices,
mandate,
Fufupau?
side
Aquí
by
le has
side
robado ese
strike
texto.
through the conversation. Here. So, looking at the sheet, they removed some shown some signs of stabilization. Shown. That part. Shown.
Tengo que gritar, ¡hay gal! ¡Hay gal en el Camp Nou!
Some signs of stabilization and employment has been changed. Changed to little changed. Implications of development in the Middle East are uncertain. Right. Implications of developments in the Middle East.
Y si os sirve de tal, que lo he consultado con ChatGPT, abrir cartas Pokémon tiene un EV negativo entre un -30 y un -50. O sea, yo he tenido la potra de que he hecho más X%, pero el EV de abrir cartas es entre -30 y -50. Vale, por si a alguien le interesaba. ¿Sabes?
For the US economy are uncertain. That was added, obviously, since the last statement. And Waller moves from cut to hold. Myron is the only one. Myron on 11-1 votes for 25 BP cut.
Ah, solo había uno de,
Okay.
uno de 12
So,
pidiendo bajadas.
you know, Warsh is going to have his work cut out for him, right? Warsh doesn't have a lot of friends. Warsh has one friend so far. You know, that's not great because, you know, it means they're probably not going to be able to do anything. All right. Let's see what else they're
Hombre, ha salido Araujo en el Barça, que es especialista en prepararlas. Chat.
talking about here. Iran. Okay, let's see here. Who is this? Chief economist at Annex Wealth. They're only guessing what'll happen with oil prices, but if inflation is projected to run 0.3% hotter without a material drag on growth, that could be optimistic on their part. Yeah, I actually agree with that. So, you know, this is not, you know, I expected a 3%, an increase to 3%. I expected headline PCE to come in at a 3% Fed expectation, as Annex Wealth puts it.
Está muy bien esto, fuera coña. Y el mercado le importa una mierda, el mercado pozo. A ver, mientras esperamos a nuestro amigo. Es que hoy es un día de pozo, chicos, más o menos. Mira, el que comprara Berkshire ha aguantado el precio y se ha llevado el eurodólar. Eurodólar 1,25, ya bueno, pero eso ya lo sabéis desde hace mucho tiempo, que el eurodólar 1,25. Pues tío, nos damos con un canto a los dientes, con Extirio HL hoy. Hoy salvamos un match ball.
Only writing up from 2.4 to 2.7 is
Sí, hemos visto lo de Amper, pero vamos, eso y nada es lo mismo.
bullish, or potentially optimistic by the Fed to not create inflation panic. Some risk that if the Fed increased inflation expectations themselves, that market expectations could rise as they have been. The 5-year, let me see if I can get a picture of it. 5-year break even on inflation. Pretty sure it's been straight up, but let me see here. 5-year, and then I'll see if I can get a screenshot of it too.
Lo que habría que saber es
yeah, dude.
a qué días hace este
Okay,
informe,
5-year
¿sabes?
over the last 5 years has kind of rocketed up. Okay, 1 second for that image. That'll cook that up for us. Okay. Yeah, I think you're definitely going to want to see this. Okay, yeah, look at this. So this is the 5-year break-even. 5-year break-even inflation chart indicates inflation expectations have now surpassed their end of 2024 high. All right. We are now at the highest. Now sit at the highest level since March of 2023. I think that was during the banking.
Coño, Juanpe, ¿has empezado a streamear ya? Un día que estés en vivo me lo dices y te raideo, ¿vale? Y nos cuentas a ver qué hay que tomar para no fallecer en un triatlón.
Crisis bailout. During banking crisis bailout. You know, obviously, the longer this goes on, the more of a risk expectations de-anchor and self-fulfill higher, right? Okay, so not great, not terrible. We got about 12 minutes until Powell comes up. A reminder, if you have not yet, go check out meetkevin.com or househack.com. Those, we do have an expiring coupon code over there, and we will have a large price increase tonight. We are also considering removing the option for individuals to buy the House Hack Valuation AI as we're getting into actually creating our Valuation AI, the next phase of the beta release, just because we might just sell it to real estate brokers because we think we can sell it for a really nice premium to real estate brokers who could then invite their clients to utilize it. So if you want access to that before it potentially goes away, check that out at househack.com. You'll be able to lock in access to it. It's a really cool tool, really making use of artificial intelligence at Househack. With that said, let's take a brief listen to Steve Leisman.
Inflation. I would say this, though. I think that what the key to me is whether or not Fed officials are seeing this oil price impulse as a negative thing for growth or for inflation. And
Apparently
if it's
not.
on the growth side, then it matters what happens to jobs, most importantly. If it's on the inflation side, it matters what happens to core and inflation expectations as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear to me, clear here, that the Fed does not think Iran will affect GDP. They raised GDP expectations for each of the next 3 years, right?
Significant revaluation of certain types of assets out there. But one place we have seen a relative amount of revaluation has been in places like private credit, like places like high yield debt. We have seen prices come significantly lower over the course of the past 2 to 3 weeks, vis-a-vis what happened in certain equity parts of the market. Should we be worried that maybe that high yield collateralized loan obligation, private credit market is telling us something that the equity markets just aren't caught up to yet?
Well, it's something to watch. Now, first of all, in the private credit markets,
En teoría, todo lo que han dicho es bueno, pero el mercado no se lo está creyendo.
that industry has evolved from fewer players to a whole lot of new players coming in. So this is part of the life cycle of an asset class over time. As more players have
Whatever. Also interesting that you've got Klarna now continuing its sell-off on the day after that Wall Street Journal article indicating that private equity is pulling some money out of these Klarna and Affirm funds, which isn't great for them because it could mean some more pressure on the consumers credit availability. Q's still rejecting 600 here, not holding. Let's go listen to the doomers.
That it was up from 12 and 13 members respectively. So that stagflationary outcome still in the back minds of so many of these Fed members.
There's no stagflation in their sheet. No stagflation at all. No
Lo veis, ¿no? Estos tíos no creen en la estanflación ahora mismo.
stagflation here. Just inflation and growth. They're writing up growth. Growth. You know, someone commented yesterday, I think it was, stagflation, and you know, maybe you're stagnating. You know, you're stagnating, but not GDP at this point, right? So the consideration here is, as long as GDP, I mean, sure, look, in fairness, 90% of 1H 2025 GDP growth was due to AI. So that could flatline.
Este pibe es muy bueno, chicos, fuera de coña. La velocidad con la que llega a todas las conclusiones, incluso sabiéndote la teoría, no es fácil.
At some point, right? That would obviously be bad. And, you know, that's where the concern is. If private credit and AI and consumer borrowing all get squeezed, then Iran is just the nail in the coffin. But so far, we're just seeing early warning signs in private credit and consumer borrowing, and really not yet in AI. It's just more of a speculation in terms of where we think we're going to end up going with artificial intelligence. Kevin, can you explain how Trump kept his tariffs despite the fact that the Supreme Court ruling? Well, the Supreme Court only invalidated the IEEPA tariffs. So, you know, Donald Trump had a few different avenues there. He could go with, you know, like Section 301.
Ahora en 6 minutos vemos, ¿no?
Tariffs, or basically he has these authorities to utilize temporary tariffs for about 150 days through some measures. And then after the Commerce Department studies them for 150 days, they could potentially last longer. It's also possible Trump could just sort of like undo those temporary tariffs and then redo them like the same night, potentially resetting that 150-day clock. So I don't, you know, while I was hoping Donald Trump would take the L in the best way possible and just say, all right, you know, we'll pass on tariffs. Supreme Court took them away. That would have been great for consumers. It would have been great for affordability. It would have been great for Republicans for the midterms. Like, if you want Republicans to win in the midterms, you should have wanted.
Nada, han mantenido tipos, pero el este no está mal, ¿sabes? Lo que están diciendo.
Tariffs to go away. IEEPA tariffs went away. And Trump not to utilize the other sections. Obviously, utilizing other sections was a probability. I think I put it down as like, you know, a combined like 60% chance of happening, that he would use some form of the combined tariffs, even though I had some hope that he would just walk away from them to get votes. He didn't. In a midterm year, it was actually somewhat shocking. But, so anyway, somebody here in the chat says, Jerome Powell goes out on top. I'm not sure what you mean. You mean on top of the market or what? I mean, Jerome Powell is probably pretty insulated from a market crash. I don't think that the market is really going to, you know, I don't think we'll see a recession in the next 2 months. You know, a larger risk factor is that the war in Iran goes on and we get $150 per barrel oil. And then we induce a recession, you know, maybe at the end of the year or the beginning of 2027. But, you know, it doesn't seem like we are, you know, inducing some kind of crazy
Sí, me habéis contado lo de Enrique de Amper y el Rey.
recession risk within the next few months. And certainly the Federal Reserve is not forecasting that either. Sup, Mikey? What else? Doomers. Yeah, exactly. Nice calling on the QQQ. You the man. Oh, thanks for saying that, Ed Edwards. Powell won't go dove or hawk. He's going to go eagle to us. America. Yeah. I mean, I think Powell just needs to, like, gracefully get through these next 2 meetings and just disappear. And, you know, he, like, that's probably best case scenario. Just stay neutral. you know, this summary of economic projections is actually quite frankly bullish. Even though Oman right now is condemning a dangerous escalation of targeting energy infrastructure. Yeah, I mean, Iran's lashing out. And in fairness, we hit their gas infrastructure, and they said they would lash out if we hit their energy infrastructure. That's exactly what's happening. So, you know, it's a little hard to say we didn't see that one coming. But, all right, let's listen to this. Oh, I hear nothing.
Of the PPI and the CPI for PCE for the month of February hotter, especially on core services. That's aside from what's going on in terms of tariff-based inflation. That is important right now, and I think that's getting lost in translation, but it does show up in the devil in the details of those dots and how the forecasts show up. You could have had one very strong forecast push up.
Y esto no se mueve, tío. O sea, de verdad. Menos tú, pero si se está pegando esto más que nunca. No sé por qué, tío. O sea, no es nada malo. No les creen una mierda a los mercados.
Raise it back in. That trade ain't coming back. Not until rate cuts or you know, PCE, well, PPI and CPI start coming down. Once they start coming down again, then you can go back to that trade.
Adding some more of that, because the reality of it is, if this conflict does wrap up, and it wraps up.
Since when did they have a bouncer at Jerome Powell's door?
It's still very, very nice for stocks, and particularly those pockets of the market.
I mean, how did Trump put it? They'll drop like a rock? Didn't he say that yesterday from the White House?
We did have this one dissent from Governor Myron, and David Heath has talked a lot about how this just, to use your word, transitory or one-offs, like he talks about the portfolio.
Qué manera de estar perdidos en los mercados todo el mundo, yo el primero. O sea, imagínate intentar predecir estas cosas, tío. O sea, estamos locos. Supuestamente los que saben, el comité de expertos, diciéndote que el PIB va a subir, que van a bajar tipos igual, que la inflación no sube. Tú imagínate, y el mercado le da igual. O sea, al mercado le dices esto y a día de hoy no se cree nada y al pozo. ¿Sabes? ¿Es posible que los datos usados para estos informes sean anteriores a la guerra? No, no creo, ¿eh? No lo creo. Lo hubiera dicho Kevin, estoy seguro. Tienen que ser muy recientes. ¿Sabes? Tienen que ser muy recientes. Compré Tulo a 16, la vendo, mantengo. Yo qué sé, tío. Júgate la cara y cruz. Mira, tengo que tener por aquí alguna moneda de las cajas estas que vienen en Pokémon. Te voy a dar una opinión razonable, ¿vale? Esto es cara, esto es cruz. Cara, vendes, ¿vale? Vende. Dame caso. Te la ha dicho, acabo de hacer un análisis serio y es venta clara. ¿Sabes?
Management. What if we are losing 92,000 jobs a month?
100,000.
Good afternoon.
Yes!
My colleagues and I remain squarely focused on achieving our dual mandate goals of maximum employment and stable prices for the benefit of the American people. The U.S. economy has been expanding at a solid pace.
Windows laptop!
While job gains have remained low, the unemployment rate has been little changed in recent months, and inflation remains somewhat elevated.
Let's go!
Today, the FOMC decided to leave our policy rate unchanged. We see the current stance of monetary policy as appropriate to promote progress toward our maximum employment and 2% inflation goals.
¿Vale?
Pretty good, pretty close to that.
The implications of developments in the Middle East for the U.S. economy are uncertain. We will remain attentive to risks to both sides of our dual mandate.
Oh!
And I'll have more to say about monetary policy after briefly reviewing economic developments. Available indicators suggest that economic activity has been expanding at a solid pace. Consumer spending has been resilient, and business fixed investment has continued to expand. In contrast, activity in the housing sector has remained weak. In our summary of economic projections, the median participant projects that real GDP will rise 2.4% this year and 2.3% next year,
¿Vale?
somewhat stronger than projected in December.
¿Vale?
In the labor market, the unemployment rate was 4.4% in
Tío, ¿y por qué esto cae? ¿Me lo explica alguien o qué?
February and has changed little since late last summer. Jobs have remained low. A good part of the slowing in the pace of job growth over the past year reflects a decline in the growth of the labor force due to lower immigration and labor force participation. It's clearly softened as well. Other indicators, including job openings, layoffs, hiring, and nominal wage growth generally show little change in recent months. In our SEP, the median projection of the unemployment rate is 4.4% at the end of this year and edges down thereafter. Inflation has eased significantly from its highs in mid-2022, but remains somewhat elevated relative to our 2% longer-run goal. Estimates based on the Consumer Price Index and other data indicate that total PCE prices rose 2.8% over the 12 months ending in February, and that excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 3.0%. These elevated readings largely reflect inflation in the goods sector, which has been boosted by the effects of tariffs. Near-term measures of inflation expectations have risen in recent weeks, likely reflecting the substantial rise in oil prices caused by the supply disruptions in the Middle East. Most measures of longer-term expectations remain consistent with our 2% inflation goal. The median projection in the SEP for total PCE inflation this year is 2.7%.
De momento lo que está diciendo es bueno. No sé por qué no sube el mercado.
And 2.2% next year, a bit higher than projected in December. Our monetary policy actions are guided by our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. At today's meeting, the committee decided to maintain the target range for the federal funds rate at 3.5 to 3.75%. From last September through December, we lowered our policy rate 0.75 percentage point, bringing it within a range of plausible estimates of neutral. This normalization of our policy stance should continue to help stabilize the labor market while allowing inflation to resume its downward trend toward 2%. But the implications of events in the Middle East for the U.S. economy are uncertain. In the near term, higher energy prices will push up overall inflation, but it is too soon to know the scope and duration of the potential effects on the economy.
Vale.
We will continue to monitor the risks to both sides of our mandate. We are well positioned to determine the extent and timing of additional adjustments to our policy rate based on the incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks. In our SEP, FOMC participants wrote down their individual assessments of an appropriate path of the federal funds rate under what each participant judges to be the most likely scenario for the economy. The median participant projects that the appropriate level of the federal funds rate will be 3.4% at the end of this year and 3.1% at the end of next year, unchanged from December.
¿Está bien?
As is always the case, these individual forecasts are subject to uncertainty, and they are not a committee plan or decision. Monetary policy is not on a preset course, and we'll make our decisions on a meeting-by-meeting basis. To conclude, the Fed has been assigned two goals for monetary policy: maximum employment and stable prices. We remain committed to supporting maximum employment, bringing inflation sustainably to our 2% goal, and keeping longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Our success in delivering on these goals matters to all Americans. We at the Fed will continue to do our jobs with objectivity, integrity, and a deep commitment to serve the American people. Thank you.
No entiendo por qué se cae el mercado.
And I look forward to your questions.
All right, Q&A. Come on,
Thank
baby.
you. Colby Smith of the New York Times. There's been some debate about whether the Fed should look through the inflation that will come from higher oil prices stemming from the Middle East conflict. Is that the right approach at this juncture? And to what extent does the fact that inflation has been above target for roughly 5 years now influence the committee's thinking around this?
So, first, let me say we're well aware of the performance of inflation over the last few years and how a series of shocks have interrupted progress that we've made over time. And that happened most recently with tariffs, and now there will be some effects on inflation coming forward.
¿Cómo se lava las manos, eh?
The thing that's really important that we see this year is progress on inflation through a reduction in goods inflation. As
It's going up, though.
The one-time effects on prices of tariffs go through the system, go through the economy. That's the main thing we're looking for going into this exercise. And we need to be seeing that to sort of understand that we actually are making progress, because on net we didn't make progress. And if you look at total inflation, total core inflation, it's about 3%, and some big chunk of that, between 1/2 and 3/4, is actually tariffs. So we're looking for progress on that. The question of whether we look through the energy inflation doesn't really arise until we have kind of checked that box. It, of course, is kind of standard learning that you look through energy shocks, but that's always been dependent on inflation.
Este ha dicho que no están en su meta de inflación porque básicamente primero los aranceles y ahora la guerra. Básicamente, se lava las manos.
Expectations remaining well anchored, and I think now it's also dependent on what you mentioned, which is that broader context of 5 years now of inflation above target. We have to keep all of those things in mind, and the question of looking through when it does arise will be one to approach not lightly, but in the context that you mentioned.
Yeah, this is a little
And just on
hawkish.
the S&P, can you help us make sense
This
of
basically delays rate cuts, I think, to the very end of the year is what he's saying, and we have to see the progress.
the headline in core inflation and the essentially unchanged forecast for growth and unemployment? Just curious, kind of what's the genesis behind the need? What's the need for the cut?
Yeah, so there are 19 people, and so 19 reasons, 19 individual submissions, but and if you notice, the median didn't change, but there was actually some movement toward a meaningful amount of movement toward fewer cuts by people. So 4 or 5 people went from 2 to 1, let's say, 2 cuts to 1 cut, and each person has individual, stories behind what they want to do. But essentially, it is that the forecast is that.
Pero hoy somos pocos porque además de ser mala hora, son media tarde, no ha avisado el stream porque son diferentes. Son 2 streams muy pegados uno del otro.
We will be making progress on inflation, not as much as we had hoped, but some progress on inflation. It should come as we start to see in the middle of the year. Progress on tariffs, going through once and then tariff inflation coming down. We should be seeing that. And, the rate forecast is conditional on the performance of the economy. So if we don't see that progress, then you won't see the rate.
Chicos, no peguéis esta troleada, tío. Es que no lo veis. Tío, el Cristo este es un troll que flipas. Mirar, chat. Mirar esto. Sois unos trolls, tío. O sea, ¿vosotros queréis que algún día tenga una opción de hablar con Kevin? No pegáis estas troleadas, tío. Sois unos trolls, tío, de mucho cuidado, ¿eh? Es que es alucinante, tío. Cristo, sal de por ahí. Encima le donas a Kevin, ¿sabes? Dónate la supa aquí y no troleéis. Madre mía.
Okay, if you don't see the progress, you won't see the rate cut. That was a big line
thank
right
you,
there.
Howard Schneider with Reuters. Just to follow up a little bit and to be clear, is the higher inflation penciled in here for 2026 solely the result of the oil shock or
Cristo,
something
menudo
else?
troll, tío.
So that's going to be part of it. But, that wouldn't be most of core, right? So the oil shock for sure shows up here. Some of that will be in core as well. But yes, but no, there's also just the feeling that we haven't seen, the progress that we had hoped for on core goods.
Not good.
And on tariffs and on the rest of it. So for whatever reason, people did write up their inflation forecast. That will certainly be tied to events in the Middle East and the price of oil. But it's also, I think, a reflection of the slow progress we've seen on tariffs, which we believe we will see. It's just a question of how long it takes for them to get all.
Tío, esto se va al pozo, macho. O sea, es que no lo entiendo, macho. Hoy es un día que toca caer y es lo que hay, chat.
The way through the economy, and it just takes some time.
Right. And is the lack of change in the SEPs, again, just to explicate this a little bit, more due to the expectation that the oil portion of this will pass through, or more out of concern that there is a potential blow to consumption and growth coming in the form of wealth effects with the stock market down, in the form of gas prices, diverting spending from other parts of the economy?
So I didn't get the second part of your question.
The consumers are going to be potentially diverting money to gasoline from other parts of the economy. There could be a growth shock or a redistribution of spending there that can hit consumption, wealth effects as well. I guess I'm wondering, is the rate forecast not changing because you think the oil shock is going to be temporary, or because you want to be sure you're positioned in case growth starts to slow.
So the thing I really want to emphasize is that nobody knows. The economics effect could be bigger, they could be smaller.
Nobody knows. Ya lo dice aquí nuestro amigo.
They could be much smaller or much bigger. We just don't know. So people are writing down something that seems to make sense to them, but have no conviction. That to your point, if we have if we have a long period of much higher gas prices, that's going to weigh on consumption. That'll weigh on disposable personal income, and it'll weigh on consumption. But we don't know if that's going to happen. Something quite different than that. We might have much lower than expected pass-through. So people write down, this is one of those SEPs where a number of people mentioned if we were ever going to skip an SEP, this would be a good one because we just don't know. So I wouldn't say there's a conviction that this is going to go through quickly or not.
Because that was a pretty good SEP, and he's basically saying, well, we almost skipped it.
That people wrote down. We don't debate how long, how do you do that? We wouldn't be able to debate what the length of or size of these effects would be. We just have to kind of make an individual statement. And also, what you've written down before you'll be reluctant to move too far away from that just because you don't know. It's so.
Me han preguntado que qué opina pues, sobre las posibles... a ver, lo diré. Tío, me sale más el inglés que el castellano. Parezco el chocas. Las posibles consecuencias de lo que puede traer el Brent tal, y cómo puede eso afectar a su política económica tal. Y básicamente ha dicho que nadie sabe nada, tío. ¿Sabes? Y que no tienen ni idea, que no saben si esto estará más, menos tiempo, cómo afectará, tal. No, o sea, nadie lo sabe. Y luego ha dicho algo como, todo el mundo hace sus predicciones, pero la realidad es que nadie sabe nada.
Unclear what the direction from this particular end will be. Meanwhile, the growth has been solid, and inflation, the overshoot is mainly from the goods and tariffs. And, the labor market is, the unemployment rate, of course, is little changed since September. You have a very, very low break-even rate, apparently, for new jobs with little growth in either demand or supply. But the U.S. economy is doing, pretty well. It's just we don't know what the effects of this will be, and really no one does.
Steve.
Mr. Chair, in the past, the staff has suggested that...
Chicos, espero que al menos... ¿cómo va el Barça? Tal. Bueno, ahora lo miramos. Espero que al menos, chicos, pues, oye, que os lo ha dicho él, que nadie tiene ni idea, que ellos no van a tomar decisiones en base a esto porque nadie tiene ni idea de cómo va a resultar esto, ¿sabes? Y que nadie lo sabe. Ya os lo ha dicho él, os lo vengo diciendo yo durante tal. Si vosotros queréis jugar a ser adivinos, pues ya está, ¿sabes?
Higher oil prices, they have a hit to consumption, which Howard was talking about, but that's somewhat offset by increases to domestic production. I wonder if you could talk about that dynamic, especially to the extent that how much U.S. production is happening right now.
So the first thing is, there is, the original thinking, the long-standing thinking, put it that way, is that you do look through energy shocks. But as I mentioned, that's conditioned on inflation expectations and that kind of thing. So, your question was?
What the staff is saying about, and has said in the past.
Yeah. So there'll be an offset.
Offsets, yeah.
So that's true. We have, we're a net exporter of energy, right? So any effects on employment and economic activity and spending would be offset to some extent by the fact that our oil companies will be more profitable and they may even do more drilling. If you ask oil companies about doing more drilling, though, they're going to want to see, a consistent rise in oil prices from where they were before the buildup for the war, and they're going to want to believe that that's going to be persistent for a fairly long time.
Resumen rápido, pues bastante optimismo, no tanta incertidumbre como se esperaba y aún así mercados cayendo. ¿Por qué? Pues yo qué sé. Pues es lo que hay.
So they're not sitting there waiting for oil to go over $70 a barrel, and then they're going to start drilling or whatever. They're going to make a reasoned, careful judgment that we're going to have higher oil prices for an extended period, meaningfully higher. So I wouldn't say there's much of that happening. Not much will be happening now, but some of that could happen over time if you see that. But so the net of the oil shock will still be some downward pressure on spending and employment and upward pressure on inflation, of course.
And if I could just follow up on Colby's question, how much do you worry that having looked through tariff inflation and inflation running above target and looking through the oil price shock would undermine the credibility of your commitment to the 2% target?
You know, we have to do our analysis and you know, think these things through carefully, but of course that's on everyone's mind. You know, we're well aware of the history, and but you don't want to overreact to that. You know, you want to make the best judgment you can based on the facts. I don't think we're going to let it color our decision making more than is appropriate. It's more the thought that it's been 5 years, and we've actually had, you know, we had the tariff shock, we had the pandemic, and now we have an energy shock of some size and duration. We don't know what that's going to be, actually. And, you know, it's one of those things where it's a repeated set of things, and you worry that that's the kind of thing that can...
Chicos, si lo estáis escuchando y lo estáis entendiendo un poco, os está diciendo una persona más lista que vuestro influencer promedio, ya sea yo o fulanito, que nadie tiene ni idea, pero ni idea, que no pueden operar en base a algo que no saben si es transitorio y demás, ¿sabes?
You know, can cause trouble for inflation expectations, and so we worry a lot about that, and we are very strongly committed to doing what it takes to keep inflation expectations anchored at 2%, and you know, I think it's important that we do that. Very important.
Nick T. Coupon expires
Nick Timmeros, Wall Street Journal. Chair Powell, you've described monetary policy as modestly restrictive. If the unemployment rate is roughly stable, inflation moving sideways in the high twos, with an ongoing overshoot in services and non-housing services, not just goods, and the economy doing fairly well as you just outlined, what gives you confidence that inflation returns to target over the...
Emerito te ha contestado al tuit. ¿A qué tuit, Josué? ¿Al tuit que he puesto yo o que ha puesto el otro Andrés? Ah, coño, este. Estaba con un poco cara de imbécil, ¿no? Pero bueno. Vamos a repostear esto. Em, ¿Cuál es mi tuit, Josué? No entiendo, Josué, no sé qué tengo que ver. Ah, ¿qué tengo que ver, Josué? Era ese, pero se ha quitado. No sé, chat. A ver, voy a ver una cosa.
the next couple of
A ver si es
years?
que tenemos
Okay.
good news.
So I would say the rate is, you can characterize it as in the high end of neutral, or you can characterize it as perhaps mildly restrictive, even modestly restrictive. No one knows for sure, but it's in that.
¿Qué mierda le pasa a esto, tío? Me ha dejado un poco tirado esto, chat. Me ha dejado un poco tirado esto. Vamos de vuelta a YouTube. Esto también lo voy a sacar.
So it looks like we're finding a worsening of the.
That might be the right case. In fact, for example, if we do see the kinds of disinflationary progress that we expect to see due to tariffs that I mentioned, I think it's hard to say, and it will depend to some extent on the size and duration of the effects we're seeing on prices, and it will depend a lot on what we can see in inflation expectations.
And just one follow-up, if I may, just on the BLS report that was mentioned briefly there. It doesn't seem from the projections or from the comments you've made today about the unemployment rate and focusing on that your view on the labour market story, to a large part being a supply-side story, has changed despite the quite negative number in February. Would that be the right take? And was there anyone else in the room who thought
me dijeron que Mérito me contestaría ayer, no me ha contestado.
Cause for concern?
No sé, bueno...
So I think you have to take the two together.
Es un evento en mayo, no tiene que
in a
contestar
way,
ya, ¿no?
the January report was a positive
Eurodólar
surprise,
bajando,
and the February
¿a cuánto?
report was a
1,24.
negative surprise.
Ya sabéis que bad
If you put them
news
together,
significa eurodólar bajar.
you get something in the middle,
Eso sí
and
lo
I
sabéis,
think
¿no?
you have to really, as you do, I'm sure, realize there was a strike
Downplays
and there
it.
was weather, and that's about 80,000 of the negative effect total on the February report.
Yep.
Notwithstanding that, so what do you see if you take a step back overall? There are a number of indicators that suggest a degree of stability, but the thing that I think good number of people in the committee are concerned about is just the very, very low level of job creation. If you adjust what has been the trend job creation over the past, let's say, 6 months, if you adjust that for what we think, our staff thinks, is the overstatement due to overcounting, effectively there's zero net job creation in the private sector. But actually that looks like that's about what the economy needs in terms of dealing with very, very low, non-existent really, growth in the labor force, which of course we've never had in our history. So you've got a sort of a zero employment growth equilibrium.
Están breando, a lo mismo.
Now that's balance, okay, but I would say it does have a feel of downside risk, and it's not kind of a really comfortable balance. So, we look at that, we see it, we get it, and I mean everybody understands the arithmetic, and that's you can say the break even is zero, but nonetheless it's something we're watching carefully, and are concerned about. But ultimately, though, you can argue that it's a consequence of deliberate policy, which is really the.
Mérito está haciendo el Jordi Wild. Le hemos hecho una oferta irrechazable, chicos, que es ofrecerle miles de views, darle a entender que la gente está con ganas de verle y por todo la maravillosa cantidad de 0 euros. Tío, si ya te rechazan eso, a gente que además son tus accionistas en parte y tal, pues chicos, yo me bajo de la vida, o sea, no sé. Pero entiendo que no me van a contestar mañana, ¿sabes?
Changes to immigration that's the biggest factor there, and
Blames Trump,
but nonetheless something we watch carefully.
Andrew.
Deliberate policy.
Thanks, Chair Powell. The economy's experienced a series of supply shocks in the last few years, COVID, tariffs, 2 oil price shocks. Do you think that is bad luck, or has something changed in the world that makes supply shocks more common? And does the central bank need to start taking account of the risk of supply shocks as a more common problem?
We did go through a long period where the shocks were all demand shocks, and so we've had a lot of practice thinking about supply shocks in the last 4 or 5 years for sure. And it's just a very different thing, and a much more difficult thing, because it does immediately raise the question of tension between the two parts of our mandate. But has the world changed? I mean, COVID is a one-time thing, right? This energy supply shock is a one-time thing. It's not because of some broad tendency or anything, I don't think. And the oil shock with Ukraine was also a consequence of military action. So I don't know that the world has changed in a way that there'll be more supply shocks. But there's people have written that paper and that speech a number of times. A number of people have tried to make the case that that is the case. And in fact, we have seen more supply shocks in the last 5 years than we've seen in many years before that. It's a fact.
Okay. You said last year that the Fed was reviewing its communication strategies, including the SEP, as part of its framework review. Whatever happened to that? And I have like 5 follow-ups to that, but I guess, what would you change about Fed communications if you had the time? Thanks.
What happened about that was not much.
¿Qué le pegan al oro si es valor refugio en momentos de incertidumbre? Pues porque viene con una subida, vamos. Es como si te digo, ¿por qué subía el oro cuando subía el SP? ¿Sabes? Entonces, en los últimos, lo que dicen aquí, en los últimos años el oro ha sido, vamos, casi un activo de riesgo, te diría. A mérito no le pagas, evidentemente, yo no pago a nadie. Mis miles y miles de visitas valen mucho dinero y tú vienes gratis. ¿Sabes? O sea, la mayoría pagan, tú no, pues es como si te estuvieras ahorrando la fee del evento, que no es barata.
Much. And I'll tell you why. So, we looked carefully at many aspects of the SEP and of our communications, and there weren't any ideas that had very broad support on the committee. And you don't want to make a change to your communications unless you have the committee behind that. So we didn't really make any changes on that. I had hoped that I had some things that I wanted to do, but they didn't attract broad support, and we'd already made all the changes we made to the framework. That was a critical thing. So we didn't. And, I wish we had been able to do some things, but we didn't. So maybe the next chair will take a look. I'm sure he will.
Le están poniendo la cabeza como un bombo al pobre Powell, ¿eh? Pensaba que para mes le pagabas. No, con Cobas es muy simple. Esta es la fee del evento. Nos encantaría que estuvierais. Si viene para mes es gratis. Y yo soy honesto, yo os cuento todo, ya lo sabéis. Corrige el tweet. ¿Qué tweet, tío? ¿Qué pasa? O sea, ¿qué le pasa al tweet? ¿Qué le pasa al tweet? ¿Eso era podcast? ¿Qué es? ¿La S? ¿O qué es? O sea, que corrija el qué. Perder. Ah, vale. Tienes razón. Perder. Venga, ya está. Pues, ¿tú crees que a Cobas que va a cerrar fondos por exceso de dinero le importa tener unas views más? Yo lo único que sé es que mi canal le ha llevado a Cobas miles de inversorios y millones de euros. ¿Tú querrías cuidar a sus inversores o no? No creo que ninguno, yo el primero, ninguno va a dar una pataleta si no vienen y decir, pues me salgo de Cobas. No. Pero tú si fueras Cobas y supieras que en un evento te diriges a miles de inversores tuyos y a millones de euros bajo gestión. Porque una cosa que creo que no sois conscientes es que cuando entra un inversor, tener inversión retail es muy difícil, ¿vale? Es muy difícil. Entonces, míos, igual tienes 5.000 inversores. 5.000 inversores, son pequeños, sí, pero son 5.000 personas. Que también es bueno que tengas el fondo segmentado y que tengas muchos clientes, ¿no? O muchos inversores. Entonces, joder, el acento, ¿qué más da el acento, tío? O sea, poner acentos SV menos para la gente que habla castellano. Siempre lo he dicho y no lo pongo ni en mi nombre, pero bueno, esto ya es personal. Entonces, ¿pueden no venir? ¿Pueden permitirse el lujo de no venir? Por supuesto que sí. ¿Sería absurdo que no vinieran? Para mi gusto, sí. ¿Sabes? O sea, si no es por mi canal, hay muchísima gente que no conocería para mes. No es broma. No os olvidéis de que en mi canal viene gente con conocimientos de inversión cero. Cero patatero. Yo les he hecho muy buena prensa, además sin querer nada. 5.000 clientes en Cobas, fácil. 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 5.000 o 3.000 o los que sean. ¿Hay gal? ¿Hay gal? Gol de quiera. Sigue habiendo partido, ha metido el cuarto el Barça. Entonces, Que sí, sois muchos, sois muchos. Entonces, ¿podría no venir? Por supuesto que sí, nadie les obliga, siguen siendo los mejores, 4-2. Eh, yo no voy a hacer la pataleta de, pues si venís, no, 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 si no venís, pues yo seguiría diciendo que son buenos, yo no funciona así. Em, pero sí que es cierto que no lo entendería, ¿sabes? No lo entendería. Pero poder permitirse no venir, por supuesto que sí. Pero yo si fuera ellos iría, no lo sé. Eh, Pagando o sin pagar, ¿eh? Mm, es lo que te digo. Luego, es verdad que Cobas ya no hace mucha publi, ¿no? No sé si en su día la hacía, porque no le hace falta, ¿no? Pero si tú vas a hacer publi a cualquier medio tipo El Economista o tipo lo que sea, te cobran una pasta y no vale para una mierda, ¿sabes? Que sí, no, 17 millones no sé, Fufupau, pero a juzgar por lo que sí sé que les han entrado otros gestores y siendo Cobas casi te diría que un must a día de hoy en una cartera, vamos, que gracias a la Pizarra De Andrés les han entrado 10 millones, pero vamos, me jugaría un brazo, porque yo sé más o menos de cifras y Cobas lo lleva todo el mundo, o casi todo el mundo a día de hoy, quizá el año pasado menos, ¿no? Entonces, sería absurdo no satisfacer a 5.000 clientes y a 10 millones de euros. Para mí sería absurdo. ¿Pueden hacerlo? Por supuesto que sí, ¿sabes? Se la sigue pegando esto, ¿no, chicos? Madre mía, tú. Y cogen este titular, ¿sabes? Cogen este titular, ¿sabes? Madre mía, tío. Que hoy era día de pozo, da igual lo que dijeran, tío.
Michael McKee from Bloomberg Television and Radio. The minutes show in January some members of the committee wanted to include a two-sided guidance on policy. Was that discussed today? And given the rise in the inflation expectations, how much support for a two-sided policy warning would there be?
So it did come up today. The policy that the possibility rather that our next move might be an increase did come up at the meeting, as it did at the last meeting. The vast majority of participants don't see that as their base case. And of course, we don't take things off the table.
Sí, Nextil muy bien,
but you correctly characterized, what was in the minutes that several participants indicated, and something very much like that conversation did happen. What was your second question, though?
Oh, it was just one question there, but follow-up would be, there are a lot of goods besides oil that are trapped in the Strait right now, and a lot of supply chains getting snarled. How much concern do you have about whether, if this becomes an inflation problem beyond just oil, whether there's anything you can do about it or would do about it, given the efficacies of monetary policy?
You can worry about other commodities. You can worry about all of the ways that oil-related commodities go into manufacturing and that kind of thing. The truth is, it's completely out of our hands, and we just, like everybody else, we have to just wait and see what happens. And it'll come down to how long, the
Coño, el Lululemon sube un 5, chat.
current situation lasts, and then what are the effects on prices, and then how do consumers react and that kind of thing. Really, I wouldn't speculate in any way, and there's really not a lot.
Somebody's asking what happened. They talked about hikes potentially for the next meeting. Several members brought it up, not a majority, but definitely talked about hikes for the next meeting.
Chair Powell, Maria Luisa Capurro with Bloomberg
Some
News.
people, right?
I wanted to ask.
Some people, again, not the majority.
Measures of
but it definitely came up.
Expectations reflect confidence that the Fed will get back to its 2% goal. But there are some colleagues of yours who have pointed to higher dispersion in household service, in business services as well. So, and that they take as a signal that inflation expectations may be less sticky than in the past. I'm wondering if there was a discussion around that at this meeting across the committee, and what were the views of what is the state of inflation expectations and the risks from higher oil and gas prices.
So at this meeting, I mean, a number of people mentioned and staff briefed on
Luego hacemos vídeo de esto, chicos.
Short-term expectations having moved up quite a lot for reasons we understand well. But long-term expectations, you can always find one that's troubling or some aspect of one that's troubling. But ultimately, right through this whole period, the overwhelming majority of the things we look to, including markets, including surveys of the public and also of forecasters, they've all been pretty solid on longer-term inflation expectations being right where they need to be.
Resumen rápido es que no se sabe nada sobre cómo va a derivar lo de la guerra, que quitando eso las cosas están bien, que ellos esperan bajadas de tipos, incluso un PIB creciente, etcétera, etcétera. No esperan esta inflación, pero el mercado, pues hoy toca pozo y hoy toca pozo, y da igual lo que digan, ¿sabes? ¿Hay gal?
Consistent with 2%. So that continues to be the case. We didn't have a lot of conversation about that. I think everyone does agree that we'll be watching those extremely carefully as we see the effects of the price increases come through from the conflict.
And still on how the discussion went across the committee, before coming to this meeting, there were some members who were discussing the risks of a slowdown in growth and at a time of where inflation remains high. It really doesn't seem that most members are penciling in a slowdown in growth.
No.
But has there been any discussion of the risks of stagflation at this point?
So people actually wrote up their growth forecast by a tenth, and I think that's probably to do with just growing confidence in productivity. And your second question was just.
If there have been any discussions about the risk of stagflation scenario.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there is tension between the two goals, right? The upward risk for inflation and downward risk for employment. So, and that puts us in a different situation. When we use the term stagflation, I always have to point out that was a 1970s term at a time when unemployment was in double figures and inflation was really high and the misery index was super high. Add them together, you get the misery index.
Qué bien explicado.
And that's not the case right now. We actually have unemployment really close to longer run normal, and we have inflation that's 1 percentage point above that. So calling that stagflation, it's not. I would reserve the term stagflation for a much more serious set of circumstances. That is not the situation we're in. What we have is some tension between the goals, and we're trying to manage our way through it. It's a very difficult situation, but it's nothing like what they faced in the 1970s, and I reserve stagflation for that, the word for that period. Maybe that's just me.
Bien explicado.
Elizabeth.
¿Has visto Torrentes? Sí.
Thanks so much. Elizabeth Schulze with ABC News. President Trump says that oil prices and overall inflation will go down very rapidly as soon as the war ends. Do you agree with that?
I don't have a forecast on that.
When we're thinking about the impact on American households, as you know,
Sí,
they've
David,
been facing these higher prices for years. They've seen an almost $1 increase in gas. How worried are you about households, especially lower income families, being able to afford those price hikes? And should people be bracing for higher costs, including for food now?
We don't know how big these effects are going to be, and I don't want to characterize them in any way. Of course, people are already seeing gas prices. Gas prices are up almost $1 a gallon. We hope that isn't for a long period of time, and of course people will feel that, but I don't want to speculate about what that might mean, because honestly that would sound like I have some idea of what's actually going to happen, and I don't think anybody really does. We're going to see how this works out, and I just would leave it at that.
6-2.
Victoria.
She wasted her questions, man.
Hi, Victoria Guido with Politico. I just wanted to ask, for purposes of the next meeting, how the Middle East war develops between now and then, how are you thinking about what might guide action at your next meeting? I mean, if we have oil prices, above $100 a barrel.
This is something he can actually answer, right?
Is that going to change your wait and see stance? Like, what would lead you all to move, or are you on hold pretty indefinitely?
¿Cómo se siente haber realizado hoy el mismo examen que les pusieron a los del año pasado? Me imagino que lo habrás hecho muy bien, ¿no?
We'll have to wait and see. I mean, we always say we're going to learn more by the next meeting, and usually we do, but in this case we're going to learn a lot, because we're going to learn 6 weeks to the day till the next meeting, and we're going to see whether what happens is it's going to be very important for the way the economy looks and the way the outlook evolves. with what happens in the Middle East, that's going to be a big factor, and we'll know that then. I don't know how it's going to affect our thinking. I really don't. And
¿Te ha gustado la entrevista?
We did talk about alternative scenarios a little bit, but it's just, I wouldn't bring that in here. It's very uncertain, and I just want to just remember that we don't know, and we shouldn't assume it's going to be one thing or another. We're going to see.
So is it a matter of you don't know how the situation itself is going to evolve, or even if things remain as they are, the economy could still remain relatively durable in face of them?
Yeah, that's true too. No, I mean,
Mañana
the US
toca
economy
pozo, probablemente
has
sí.
just,
El podcast está en YouTube, en Rompiendo el Mercado.
It's been strong through a whole bunch of challenges. I mean, if you go back to 2023 when we raised rates a lot in 22 and 23, and close to 100% of economists called for a recession, which didn't happen. In fact, 2023 was a really strong year. So the U.S. economy has really been just doing pretty well through a lot of significant challenges over the past few years. It's been amazing to see. And I don't know what's going to happen in the next intermeeting cycle, and I don't know what's going to happen in the Middle East. I wouldn't want to speculate.
Hi, Chair Powell. Thanks for taking our...
Puede ser, Efo, puede ser. ¿Has dicho que estoy como cencerro en tu anterior directo? ¿Me ha dolido? ¿Por qué? Ah, bueno, es que, tío, también te haces unos vídeos, Josué, que es que te encanta prenderle fuego a todo.
Our questions. What makes you so certain that tariff-related price increases will be a one-time effect?
Pero esto, si mantienes el bono de medio plazo, beneficia a la renta fija, aunque en principio hace caer el valor liquidativo del bono actual. Lo sé porque he hecho el curso ayer. No te has enterado. Esto no va a beneficiar nunca a la renta fija. Lo que haría sería recuperar tu pérdida. Pero si mañana suben tipos, el bono nuevo que se ha parecido al tuyo pagará más. Con lo cual, sí, tú no perderás, recuperarás tu dinero, pero no te benefician nada, ¿sabes?
I don't think we've seen you since the Supreme Court tariff decision, and it's pretty clear that none of us know what the extent of the tariff shock will be as the administration moves to replace some of the tariffs that were overturned. So I suppose I'm curious, what would make you question this certainty that tariffs are going to be a one-time price effect?
No guarantees. I would not at all use the word certain about my views on that. I'm not certain. I'm uncertain. But just if you think about what it is, it's a one-time increase in the price of a good, right? And what inflation is ongoing increases in prices this year, next year, the year after. That's what inflation is. It's not a one-time price increase. There's a very, very big difference. The public doesn't really focus on that, but that's the difference. And tariffs should be in theory, unless they cause people to start expecting still more tariffs the next year and still more tariffs the next year. They should be a classic one-time thing. People say the same thing traditionally about an energy price spike, because traditionally...
El problema, chicos, que tenéis es que queréis, que van a subir tipos, me voy de la renta fija. Es que no es fácil, porque este entorno, mira, el entorno actual es perfecto para el que tenga miedo se vaya de la renta fija. Pero es que no sabes si va a ocurrir eso, o si la guerra se va a ir al carré y esto va a volver a la normalidad. No tenéis ni idea. Pero si alguien estuviera pensando, me da miedo la renta fija si suben tipos, sobre todo la renta fija riesgoso, ese momento es ahora. Porque luego vais detrás del precio. Vais a querer salir cuando esto ya haya caído. Digo, suponiendo que esto vaya mal, que yo no creo que vaya a ir mal, ¿no?
Prices go up and they come back down. And by the time monetary policy would react, you would... It would be over. So I don't have tons of confidence on that. I mean, I think the theory is probably right, but as usual...
Es totalmente malo porque tu renta fija ya tiene unos bonos que pagan poco. Con lo cual, si suben tipos, tú no te beneficias de los tipos nuevos. Porque tus bonos se la pegan. ¿Sabes? Se beneficiarán los que compren la renta fija más abajo, pero tú ya estás comprado. ¿Sabes? No sé si me explico.
The time it takes to get all the way through the economy is just very uncertain. And we found that coming out of COVID, that the inflation did go away, and largely for the reasons we thought it would, but it took 2 years longer than we thought. And so I think we have to be humble about knowing how long it will take for tariffs to go all the way through the economy. And so what we've been doing, as our staff's been doing, it's very interesting. they started off with just an estimate because there wasn't a real history. And then they've built, based on the history that they're seeing of tariffs coming through into prices, they can now have an arc. And for all the tariffs, they can say, well, so we have, I think, a slightly more confidence that we will see tariff inflation coming down, not prices, but you won't see further increases. And we should start seeing that more and more in the middle parts of the year. We do expect that. Now, you're also right, though, that the level of tariffs came down fairly meaningfully in the wake of the court decision, but the administration said they're going to get that rate right back up to where it was. So
Una duda, si suben tipos algo de renta fija y compro bonos, sí ganaría, pero te tendrías que salir ya y comprar los bonos cuando suban los tipos, es decir, acertar. Pero si no, dice caso y literal se me ha olvidado y perdió la contraseña de MyInvestor, solo sé que todos los meses mando dinero a esa cuenta y que se invierte porque me llegan los correos de confirmación de compra, que es lo que Claro, pues es que es lo más... Yo entiendo que si os gusta esto, lo sigáis pues conmigo y tal, y está guay, a mí me gusta enterarme tal, ¿sabes? Pero bueno, no toco, ya habéis visto que yo no toco grandes cosas, ¿sabes?
and we assume that they'll do that over time. So that's how we think about it.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Chris Rugaber at Associated Press. You talked about the shortcomings of the SCP in this environment. I wanted to ask about, or throw in an additional thing, which is the fact that it's happening before transition. Is there still some value, perhaps, in the public knowing what other Fed officials are thinking, the ones who will stay on for the rest of the year and beyond? And does that even handicap your successor in any way? Well, just in terms of having a whole committee expressing its views, is that something that locks them in for the rest of the year?
No. We never. The SEP is never. People are more than happy to change their SEP dots. They're no way bound by them. It's your opinion at a moment in time, which can change based on events. Sometimes very quickly. So it never locks people in. People are more than happy to be proven wrong in either direction. And so I just think we do it. And, I mentioned this was a time when it's very hard to do it. During the pandemic,
Andrés, un directo analizando bien Storm, lo llevo y es brutal. Sí, ahora mismo la verdad es que se están comportando muy bien.
Actually took one meeting off, I think. But we don't like to do that just because it's hard to do. We should just keep doing it. But I just would say for this one, though, I think it's even more than usual good to take the forecast with a grain of salt because subject to just very high levels of uncertainty.
It was a good forecast.
Brian.
Hi, Chair Powell. Brian Chung with NBC News. So you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that you're well aware of the history of inflation running above target. It seems like that might be what's underpinning the affordability problem that we're hearing a lot about on Main Street. Are there any signs to you that that's impacting the psychology of the consumer, especially given that they're a big driver of overall economic activity?
I'm not sure what that's all about, but what I think and what we see in surveys, and that is,
Ahora hago un vídeo de esto, chicos. Cuando acabe hago un vídeo, ¿vale? Lo estoy escuchando.
All around the world, by the way, everywhere in countries like the United States had basically the same kind of thing. It was global inflation coming out of the pandemic, and everywhere people are feeling like real wages have been going up in the United States now for 3 years, roughly. But people are not feeling good about it yet, and it will take some years of positive, real earning gains for people to feel good again, we think. But you're right. But when you talk to people, they do feel squeezed, and
Powell's last meeting is April 29th.
Prices are still going up, like insurance. Various different kinds of insurance are getting more and more expensive, and that's just.
¿Veis que le aplaudirán todos cuando se vaya? ¿Alguno de Powell? ¿Alguno de
Catching
Powell?
up really from inflationary pressures that take a while to get to into the price. So we take it very seriously. We don't dismiss it at all. It's a very real thing from the standpoint of what people are experiencing, and what it does for us is, makes us even more committed, if that's possible, to getting inflation back to 2% on a sustained basis.
How does the Fed's independence play into the ability to address affordability?
Well, independence is what allows us to do our jobs, and stable prices is half of our mandate. It's one of our 2 mandates. Maximum employment being the
Ha dicho que la última es la de abril.
I mean, look at every advanced economy that looks anything like the United States, anywhere.
Tío, la conferencia no ha sido mala. Es cierto que ha dejado esa frase en esa pregunta de, tío, que no tengo ni idea de lo que va a hacer el Brent o la guerra o lo que sea, ¿sabes? Aigal. Em, pero la conferencia no ha sido mala, ni mucho menos. Ellos son más o menos optimistas con los datos que manejan. También han dejado muy claro que lo de la guerra no saben cómo ¿sabes?
The world in a market economy, in a democracy, and you'll see, pretty much central bank independence that looks a lot like, in some cases, stronger than what we have. But it's critical that we have that so that we can do the things when we need to do them to preserve price stability. And it's an accepted standard practice, and I think has a lot of support, certainly in Congress, which is where our oversight is.
Yes, that's correct. If the participation rate goes up, along with the energy shock, households will get pushed more, and unemployment will go up. That's correct.
Hi, Chair Powell. Richard Escobedo at CBS News. Thanks for doing this. 2 questions. One, how high would oil prices and broader inflation have to go, and for how long for the committee to consider hiking rates?
Ni de coña te va a contestar.
And then secondly, diesel prices are rising faster than gas prices. How concerned are you that the increase in diesel might drive up food and goods prices and lead to broader inflation?
Yeah, I'm not going to give you an example or specific answer on the first question. We're prepared to do what needs to be done, but I wouldn't want to hypothesize about what that
También
might be.
hacéis unas preguntas de
in terms of
pipero,
diesel
macho.
prices, so your question there is, are we concerned about it? I mean,
how concerned, and whether or not it will drive up, the cost of food and other goods that really rely on it to.
So I think it's a more general concern than that. It's diesel prices because that's transportation of food and things like that. There are just lots of ways that oil and derivatives of oil get into the production and transportation of many things. So, and those, there are big effects in headline inflation, but things like that leak into core as well. And the effects may not be as big, but they're quite real and they're material. So we are aware of that and we're watching it, but we're right at the beginning.
Me ha preguntado que cuánto tendría que subir a cuánto tendría que subir el barril y durante cuánto tiempo para subir tipos. Y claro, el otro ha dicho, no te voy a contestar algo tan específico, ¿sabes?
This, and we don't know how big we just don't know how big this will be and how long it lasts. It may or may not be something that really makes a big imprint on the U.S. economy. We're just going to have to wait and see.
Thank you.
Archie, for the last question.
Last question, and then summary.
Thanks very much. Just to sort of stare into the future for a little bit, I was looking at the longer run bits of the SEP and noticed that the growth estimate had been revised up a good chunk from 1.8 to 2, and the kind of long-term Fed funds rate as well. It'd be great just to hear, is that AI productivity or what's going on there exactly?
Yeah, I think it's just productivity. We actually started seeing meaningfully higher productivity some years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago. And that's not because of generative AI. We won't know for years what it's really due to, but it could be due to the kind of things that people did during the pandemic to economize and somehow become more productive because there was an incredible labor shortage. But I think economic forecasters are very skeptical of periods of high productivity because they're so rare and they're often revised away. And for many of us, I never thought I'd see this many years of really high productivity, and by the way, expect it to continue. And we haven't really started to see the effects of generative AI, and that should certainly contribute to that. So it's quite unusual, and it's this is the higher productivity is the thing that allows incomes to rise over time. And so it's a great thing. Was that your question?
Yeah, no, I was just curious what lay behind that. And just briefly on that as well to finish up, you hear the argument a lot, this is a sort of disinflationary story, and if you believe that productivity thing, that should also weigh down on inflation over time, maybe then kind of pull down where rates end up. Do you kind of agree with that line of thinking, or do you think that's not how you should think about weather rates.
I think you have to be cautious about that, in particular if you're talking about AI, about generative AI. So remember, in the short term, what's happening is we're building data centers everywhere, and that's actually putting pressure on all kinds of goods and services that go into building these things. So that's actually probably pushing inflation up at the margin. In addition, it probably raises the neutral rate. So in the near term, you're not looking at something that would immediately call for lower rates or that would be lowering inflation. Over time, though, sure, it can be if it's expanding potential output, which is what higher productivity does, then it actually can be. But I think it's an empirical question because it's really is the demand growing faster or slower than the supply side. And I think we just don't know that answer ex ante going in. We'll just have to wait and see. Thank you very much.
All right. Remember, we got a coupon code expiring tonight over at meetkevin.com and HouseHack. Let's get into doing a full summary of what we just heard. And boy, oh boy, we heard a lot of information. It looks like the Qs are now down at 597. Lows of the day after this presser. So let's break down what just happened.
A ver, vamos a escuchar.
All right. Well, Jerome Powell just gave us his press conference. Rates remain unchanged, and he gave us a beautiful, delicious summary of economic projections that didn't imply rate hikes, that implied GDP growth, and that implied a stable unemployment rate. And then Jerome Powell had to come out during the meeting and say, never mind that, we actually almost skipped doing his summary of economic projections because we literally have no idea. And instead, we talked about rate hikes. Yeah, boy, oh boy, we got a lot to break down in this one because our expectations got turned on the head of what we thought. First, let's start with that summary of economic projections. What we were looking for in the summary of economic projections was a projection of under 3.6 for the Fed funds rate. We got that. We got no movement here in the median. 3.6, 3.6, 3.6, 3.5. Perfect. Great. Then they even wrote up GDP. They brought GDP up 1/10 this year, up 3/10 next year, up 2/10 next year. This was a beautiful summary of economic projections. Everything about the summary was great. No stagflation here, a little bit of inflation, not a lot though. They only moved up the projection from 2.5.
No sé si lo borrará Sergio, no.
To 2.7 over
Ahora grabo
here
yo mi vídeo, voy a escucharle.
Or 2.4 to 2.7 on PC. I thought markets would even be okay with going all the way up to 3% here because of the Iran shock. So overall, the summary of economic projection seemed fantastic. This was really good. Now, one thing that was bearish was in the actual statement, they did mention that they removed the employment and the labor market has shown some signs of stabilization, and they changed that to the labor market is little changed. That was a little bit disappointing to see. It wasn't part of the summary of economic projections, but it was part of their statement. Waller ended up moving from cut to hold, and so we got 11 votes to hold and 1 vote, that was Stephen Myron, for a 25 basis point cut. So far, Kevin Warsh only has one friend. If, of course, he takes over, because there's always the chance that Jerome Powell stays, which he also implied that he might stay. More on that and the mechanics of that in just a moment, which means we would probably delay rate cuts even more. Okay. A lot to break down here. I just have to get it out of the way. Yes, we're doing a large price increase on the programs on building your wealth at meetkevin.com. You can write it off on your taxes, almost certainly. Talk to your CPA. But you get all 9 courses.
Me doy cuenta que aquí todo Dios vende cosas, ¿eh? Imagínate que yo os estoy spameando a Artemisa todo el día. Pensaríais, qué pesado este tronco, macho, ¿no? Pues está en todos los streams, tío. Es muy heavy. ¿Cómo le gusta la plata a todo Dios, eh? Vamos. ¿Cómo le gusta la plata a todo Dios?
Report every private live stream, every trade alert, short-term trades, day trades, medium trades, long-term trades, and all of the courses on building your wealth. You'd use that coupon code TOOBIG2RIG. And the reason we came up with Too Big to Rig is because of the employment report, which Jerome Powell told us about as well. Jerome Powell, we predicted yesterday, would end up trying to average the January and February unemployment reports. If you go back 24 hours ago to my video, Prepare for the Fed's Rug Pull, I said that we're not going to get a change in rates, but Jerome Powell is probably going to average the January and February jobs reports and then say the focus right now is on inflation, potentially even implying rate hikes in the future. And unfortunately, exactly that prediction is what happened. Jerome Powell bluntly said, well, January was a positive surprise, February was a downside disappointment, but if you average them out, you're relatively close to zero, which is likely as a result of deliberate immigration policy. And since the unemployment rate isn't moving, maybe that's okay. Now, that totally ignores the fact that the Bureau of Labor Statistics just happened in January and February, but only in the February report is when we got the revision, revised down the labor force participation rate by 0.4% in January, which they revised that in February. And then they revised down February by another 0.1%. So that way they could tell the whole world, oh, guys, labor force participation has barely changed. Sure, from your revision. But if you add together the revision and the adjustment you made for February, it actually changed a lot. Labor force participation plummeted 0.5%. So if labor force participation stayed stable or if it goes back up again,
vale,
the
chicos,
unemployment rate's going to skyrocket
on
the 12-month good this goes on. So he could be here for an
absolute
up
as of the weighted.
A mi vídeo me interesa.
Only fortunately a price we don't really do lower implying 25 basis point cut in the labor market 10th this year 90 and say never mind that we actually almost skipped doing a summary of economic projections because we literally have no idea and instead we talked about
tenemos una vivienda y queremos comprar otra pero no disponemos del capital. ¿Se puede rehipotecar la vivienda para comprar la otra? Sí, claro. Pues pedir una pedís una pues que queréis rehipotecar un inmueble, ¿sabes?
Rate hikes. Yeah, boy oh boy, we got a lot to break down in this one because our expectations got turned on the head of what we thought. First, let's start with that summary of economic projections. What we were looking for.
Vale, esto. Esto más esto. Vale, chicos, ¿qué queréis? ¿Que salga del stream? Tengo que salir 5 minutos y me vuelvo a conectar. ¿Queréis eso para que no se borre o qué? Chicos. ¿Sí? Pues vale, pues cierro stream. Entro en... Son y 34, entro y 40. Chicos, que tiene que haber un decalaje. Ahora entro de